Dusty Baker was asked about his biggest regret while manager of the Houston Astros. Here's what he had to say.
I love Houston, and I like the organization. I like Jim Crane especially because he's one of the few people in the game that never you know told me a lie, and I'm big on being honest with me. And but the one thing that kind of bothered me a little bit is that uh, I didn't. I only chose one person on my staff, and when you choose your staff, most of the time loyalty comes with it. Not to say they were disloyal, but that was AJ Hinch's staff. Everybody there except one guy, and that's like inheriting another guy's. Well, a president inheriting another president's cabinet. I mean, it's it was we had a footprint on how to win, but I wish that I could have had more freedom on choosing my staff.
I think he just politely said he didn't like Joe Espada there. That's as close as he'll ever come to saying it. And supposedly there were some disagreements between the two, never bubbled to the surface, but people more connected to the Astros than me have told me, yeah, these guys didn't like one another. I think it's a little extreme to compare your coaching staff to a presidential cabinet. But what was interesting to hear along the way there, other than talking about it's all about loyalty. Not to say any of those guys were disloyal. Again, that's got to be Joe Espada. But hearing Dusty Baker say he liked Jim Crane and that Crane never lied, that he was a straight shooter, that is interesting to me. Because it does feel like Crane shoved him out, no? And what's interesting is when we heard all of the hullabaloo about what the Astros were doing at GM before they hired Dana Brown, with, of course, the organization really, after James Click, making Jeff Bagwell a part of the decision-making process. Reggie Jackson was involved as well. They went away from who they had been, and they started to do things that you would think that Dusty Baker would have been aligned with. Going away from analytics, going towards maybe an old school approach to baseball. I would have thought Baker would be co-signing a lot of these things. Maybe not some of the decisions that were being made about the lineup, but that was interesting because I was under the impression that the only way that Dusty Baker would have moved to the side the way that he did was if he was pushed out. Is that Espada? Is that Crane? Again, I feel like a lot of this circles back to, I hear that clip and I just hear Dusty Baker didn't like Joe Espada.
Yeah, that's the feeling that I get too when he says, like, again, my biggest regret. And then I love Jim Crane, da 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 da. I didn't get to hire staff. And there's only I guess the Astros are different because they have 2 hitting coaches and 2 pitching coaches, but in general, that's 3 positions that he's talking about. The hitting coach, the pitching coach, and the bench coach is like what you would be talking about there. And yeah, that's what it feels like, a little bit of a Spada.
Right, because look, it makes sense to have the same coaching staff that made it to Game 7 of the World Series the year before after a scandal happens, and you have to have a fall guy, and AJ Hinch is the fall guy. It's a weird situation to come into. So I can understand why Baker would be annoyed there. But what, you're gonna blow out the whole staff because of what it seems like Carlos Beltran had made a part of this organization, and Alex Cora had made a part of this organization.
Left.
They're not even having there, right?
Yeah, and it wasn't a situation where it was a failed staff. The staff I mean, they had the 2019 was probably the best team in Astros history.
Yeah.
Like, as far as just talent and wins, it was the best team in Astros history. So you don't want to rock the boat too much there. And a little bit when he got let go was, I think, February or March it was like around spring training of 2020. Obviously, 2020 season would get pushed back. We didn't know at that time, but you don't want to have to, okay, let's hire a coach, and now he has to hire a brand new staff. Maybe what Dusty would say is, hey, that should have happened after the 2020 season, but And that's fair, I guess, if you want to have the Dusty perspective on that. But
That was a bad year.
yeah,
They made it to the ALCS, but right, like
at a certain point, yeah, I should be able to hire my guys. But yeah, I don't. That it does feel like an Espada thing.
it almost feels like Espada was tabbed as a successor before hiring Baker.
And they didn't want to, like in 2020, and I think this was a smart move. They didn't want to fire AJ Hinch and then, all right, bench coach, you're up, in this like
Yeah.
super, under the microscope kind of way.
It would have looked weird.
Yes,
But-
hiring, and also what Dusty Baker and what we thought he was brought in initially as just kind of good PR because everyone loves Dusty Baker.
Yep, 100%. That was a big part of it. So we
Yeah.
bring in Dusty Baker. We're going to keep the entire staff. So that's really, I guess, Dusty's only complaint about his time with Houston. And he was asked about big decisions the Astros have going forward, and not salty like he was with the bloggers and the tweeters, which I felt he was justified in being salty with a year ago. Here is Dusty Baker talking about what's next for the Astros, who have some big decisions coming up.
I do believe in Jim Crane because he's not opposed to, to spending some money to stay on top. I mean, he expects to stay on top. I mean, I don't play golf. If you talk to people that do play golf with him, I mean, he expects to win, and he's spoiled by winning, and winning spoils you. And so, I don't see him sparing, any expense to try to remain on top and get a good team.
So it means he thinks he's at least willing to spend. And I do feel like the further we get away from the end of the year and the further we get away from Alex Bregman having tweeted out, "Thank you, Houston," the more I feel like they're going to try to bring him back. We will see, of course, but Baker continued talking about Jim Crane and some of the tough decisions, and first talked about Alex Bregman before two other key Astros whose contracts are up after next year.
I hope they sign Bregman because he's one of the pillars on that team and one of the guys. I mean, he's one of the guys that I can depend on, to send a message, and I don't have to tell him what message to send. I mean, this is what I loved about Bregman, and Tucker and Framber are pillars on that team. I mean, you got Tucker that can do everything. You got Framber, to me, who's in the Cy Young Award race that you never hear about. And he's probably the best left-hander in baseball, and he's thrown more innings. I mean, people say Scoville, but I mean, Scoville hadn't been around as long as Framber.
And then he goes off on this tangent about Framber Valdez for a very long period of time. Oh, his durability he started talking about. But those are some tough decisions that he's going to have to make. And I think they do need to keep Alex Bregman. Framber, can you really afford to let him walk just given that durability side of things? I thought it was a good point Baker brings up. And he talks about Framber's durability for about a minute and a half afterwards on the show podcast with Joel Sherman and John Heyman. And yeah, I mean, think about all the Astros injured pitchers right now. That's the one guy who he's dealt with a couple of injuries for sure, but no Tommy Johns. Wait, hang on. Has he had one? Honestly, I've lost track. There's been so many with the Astros.
No, Framber. I don't think Framber's had one. Framber's, he is right. He isn't generally healthy. He does take the ball a lot.
He had left elbow soreness earlier this year, and I think for a moment we were like, "Uh-oh."
mentally, we just gave him Tommy John surgery.
Hmm.
Like when that report comes out, we were probably so beaten down. I don't know when that report was. I'm just going to guess at that point in the season, we're so beaten down that we're like, duh, Tommy John coming.
That's just what you expect. And then you expect
You're right,
the
a
Astros.
lot.
You expect the Astros training staff to do some sort of like 1700s barber surgeon stuff on them and accidentally cut off the arm.
His arms on backwards.
Right, like they're gonna cut off both of the Astros players' arms and then throw them at the next person who underestimates Jose Ramirez. That's what they're gonna do. Quoting Aaron Boone there. Dusty was asked about how the Astros have kind of changed their stripes over the years. And if you were listening to yesterday's show with Jeremy Booth from KHOU. He was talking about it as well, how the Astros went away from being analytical and went in a different direction. Here's Dusty talking about that.
Well, that's what Jim Crane wanted. He wanted a more of a mixture versus just one way. And people talk about analytics. I mean, analytics have been around for years. It's just that it didn't have a name for it. From the time I started managing and studying, like I was studying first batter efficiency, or walks per inning from the bullpen, or who hits with runners in scoring position. All this stuff has been around for a long, long time. It's just that we've gotten very, very complicated with it in the terminology. And if you don't know the terminology, then supposedly you don't know what's going on. But hey, if we were just speaking layman terms, we'd all understand. You know what it is.
I agree with Dusty here, but here's the problem. Some of the nerds are going to find this and they're going to kill him. They are going to go after him more than they already did before, because he looks at those advanced statistics that I look at as well, and he rolls his eyes at them. BABIP, Klondorp, all the other things. Klondorp's not real, but you get what I'm saying. It's the stat that I say all the time to make fun of the many advanced statistics in baseball. There is a point where maybe you're looking at too much information to determine who hits where, who hits when, who pitches where, when, etc. And I felt like Dusty got a lot of unfair crap for that last year. I know that there are others who will push back on that, but I mean, were things better with Joe Espada running the show this year? A guy who, based off of this interview that Baker did with these two, Sherman and Heyman, doesn't really seem like Dusty Baker liked Espada much, reading between the lines.
Yeah, he didn't say anything specifically about Espada, but again, in the first clip that we played, that was both of our reaction to
He
it.
said he wished that he had been able to pick his own staff. He only got to pick one of the coaches on the Astros coaching staff. Would have been hard to do that, just given, I mean, they had won the World Series. Or excuse me, not won the World Series. They got to Game 7 of the World Series.
Yeah.
God, sorry for saying that.
And not Santa has the date. He said that Dusty was hired on January 29th of 2020.
Correct.
So it would have been a tough overhaul.
Before pandemic hire. Interesting.
Yeah.
Makes you think. Was that part of God's plan? I don't know.
We can't keep doing this.
Sorry.
We can't keep...
CJ Stroud, that answer. I like CJ Stroud a lot. That's the most insufferable answer he's given this year. Anyway, bringing it back to Dusty Baker and his interview that he did on this podcast. He continued talking about the way that baseball has changed.
The game is still played by human beings, and the game and the players have feelings. When they're when they're taken in and out, when they're pinch hit for, or when they're told that they can't hit this guy or that guy. I mean, as a former player, that would have really bothered me, for you to take me out and make me feel like I can't necessarily hit this guy, because I'd stay up all night trying to figure out. That's the joy of competition, when you stay up all night trying to figure out how to hit this guy or how to solve this guy. So, still a wonderful game. It's like last night during the game, it was a good game, but it was full of mistakes. It's full of base running mistakes, full of walks, full of just mistakes, and some of it by veteran players that know better. And so it's still a great game. It's just sometimes it's not as easy to watch as it used to be.
That comment does sound a little bit like old man yelling at a cloud. A little bit, especially when combined with the one that you just heard before. Because he's talking about how, hey, they're human beings and their emotions might get affected because you're making decisions based off of statistical numbers, and you should be just trying to win and beat these things and adjust to these things. But I know that the nerds out there are going to circle like vultures around the carcass of this podcast, and they're probably going to dump on Dusty Baker some more. So there you go.
I didn't think anything he said was like too old man yells at cloud.
I agree.
I think especially the earlier clip where it's like, no, we both know, like when you're from his perspective and from the analytics perspective, if you're talking about baseball, you're saying the same thing. It's just you're like you said, speaking almost a different language but you both you understand baseball and you're understanding the same thing. It's just the lost in translation kind of effect. I do think that is part of it. It's just like a little bit it's on the analytics people just to like honestly a lot of it would just go a long way of just like explaining the stat like just
It would help and why it's useful, why it's not.
Yeah, and the limitations of it.
Instead of being a pardon my French, C word about it to people that don't necessarily agree with you online. Like, that's my big problem with these people that are pushing this statistic movement in baseball. Some of these stats I'm sure are very useful, but you are such jerks with the way that you think this is the only way to look at things. And it's not as black and white as you're making it out to be.
That's exactly it. It's easy. I mean, it's not hard to look at these stats, learn what they mean, what they're measuring, and just go, okay, so the higher the better, the lower the better.
Yeah.
But it's not as simple like implementing that into running a baseball team. It's actually not that simple. Of
I
just
agree.
going, oh, okay, I get what WAR is now. Let's just play all the high WAR guys. It's like no, there's a little bit more that goes into this. There's
Correct.
like Dusty said, it's still a game played by people and having that, and that's why I think most of the manager's job is that stuff. And I thought Dusty Baker was good at that stuff.
I totally agree. I mean, they won a lot with him running the show with a staff that was not his, that seemingly was at odds with him, just based off of this conversation that he had. So you can check out that full interview. I thought it was interesting. I always liked Dusty Baker, and I felt like he got a bad rap while he was here, much worse rap than he deserved. The team stopped hitting in last year's postseason. Nothing he did in last year's postseason had anything to do with the fact that they went home early and the Rangers were able to win the World Series. And I would say the same thing about Joe Espada this year. I do think that the manager role in baseball, it is an overstated one, but I look at where this team is and just the people that cover it, and specifically the nerdy, psychotic, stat-oriented people who were so vicious with Dusty Baker. I know they are going to find this and they are going to go after him for it. And I don't think it's deserved. I feel like he's just explaining his perspective on it. And baseball is not a black and white, these stats mean X, Y, and Z kind of game. It's not. No sport is. Baseball, for whatever reason, though, seems to think that it is that way. At least the people that seem to have taken over the game. And I wouldn't mind them being elbowed out. Obviously, I would have preferred the Astros not run off James Click and totally move away from baseball, people making baseball decisions. And I get it. Craig Biggio, he's a baseball star, and Jeff Bagwell, baseball star, and Reggie Jackson, baseball star, all that stuff. But at the same time, you do want people who are also on top of the sport, doing the scouting things and all that. Still, there is an element of the nerds taking over the kitchen, and I don't think it's necessarily helping. And I feel like the way that they carry themselves makes it so that a lot of people are just going to be resistant by default to what's being pushed, in the same way that we sometimes see certain people who are preachy with their politics get pushed back against, even if they are making good points, because they're doing it in a dickish way.